Hey there, welcome back to the Complicated Kids podcast. I'm your host, Gabrielle Nicolay. I am a toddler whisperer, a speech therapist, and a parent coach. And today I have Emily Roper with me. Emily, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Even before we hit record, I knew this was going to be like a very, very good conversation. So I'm excited for the folks to listen. Before we dive in, would you just tell the good people something about yourself and what you do?
Sure. Well, I'm a neurodevelopmental delay therapist, which is probably not something most people in the US have heard of. So I'm sure we'll get into that. So I work with kids that have developmental delays, ranging from things like anxiety, ADHD, autism, kind of the whole spectrum. Work with plenty of kids that don't have a diagnosis. And I am also a certified midwives assistant. I have been working in the birth work field for well over a decade. And I just do both. I can't really pick one career. So I have a private practice where I work with kids, and then I also do birth work PRN.
And because I'm going to be wondering this the whole time, where is your private practice, please?
It is in Colorado Springs, but I also do a lot of remote work. So I work with families all over the world.
Love it. And why have we not heard of a neurodevelopmental delay therapist?
For whatever reason, it just is not huge in the US. The school that I went to for my postgrad work is based out of the UK. So it's bigger there. Germany has a huge branch. There's a lot of therapists there, but it's something that is just kind of slowly taking off in the US. So we're just kind of, it's trickling here, but hopefully one day it'll be big.
Well, and it's a really interesting, I mean, from my perspective, that's super fascinating because you're looking at development. Number one, you're looking at neurodevelopment, yay, through the lens of very early experiences. Yeah.
That's right.
Okay. So, but we can like just play in this puddle for a second. What does that even mean? What does it mean what I just said?
Sure. So when I am looking at kids, I'm looking at a bunch of different pieces of early brain and body development. So things that are developing during pregnancy, during birth, and during that early infancy period. So these are going to be things like attachment, which I'm sure everybody's all familiar with, things like our stress response and how our startle reflex and our reaction to the environment develops and changes as we age. I look at things like early primitive reflexes. So babies are born with a set of reflexes that help them with the birth process, that helps them to survive, and most importantly, it helps them to develop a lot of more advanced skills that they will need later. So we have a lot of these early reflexes that help us with things like processing sensory information, with developing visual skills. So, how our eyes move and how we can track and use our eyes and how our brain gets information from them. It helps to develop things like balance and coordination and posture. And all of these early skills are foundational for the rest of our brain to develop. So we need all of these pieces to be in place before we're going to have good things like emotion regulation or before we have good executive function for sure. Those are much more like later advanced skills that are all built on these early foundational pieces. And unfortunately, most of the time, what happens is you have an older child that's struggling with big emotions or they're behind in school. And so we look at it as an executive function problem or an anxiety problem. And we don't actually back up and look at all of these early foundational pieces and ask, whether or not these kids have the tools that they need to function properly. So all of those, more advanced skills, these are developed skills. These aren't things that we worry about when the 2-year-old can't read or when they have meltdowns. Those are not skills that we expect 2-year-olds to have. We expect those to develop as kids get older, and that development process is built on these earlier pieces functioning well.
Okay. So I just heard like the whole audience go like, yeah, that's my kid. Emotional dysregulation and no executive function.
Yep.
But is it too late? I mean, those kids are 6, 7, 12, 14 sometimes.
Mhm.
There's two questions here. One is, and you can take them in whatever order you want, but like, what should we be looking at in infancy that we're not seeing, that we don't know we should look at? And number two, is it too late to go back and kind of backfill some of these prerequisites for the skills that we want our kids to develop?
So I'll start with the second question. No, it's never too late. I even work with adults sometimes. I'm very picky about adults, so mostly just prefer the kids. But the brain is very adaptable and it's able to change and create a lot of growth and healing in this area if you give it the right tools, and have kind of the right approach. So I don't even really see a massive difference between like 5 and 6 year olds and my teenagers as far as how quickly or capable their brains are to make changes. There are other things. Obviously, the longer you live with that, the like different symptoms look a little bit different. But it doesn't seem like it's much harder to work with teens than it is with younger kids.
Mhm.
So yes, the brain can definitely change. And there's a lot of pieces of early infancy. That's, again, probably like a whole nother podcast episode, but there's a lot of things that can kind of disrupt that early development process. A lot of things that go wrong kind of in pregnancy. So before the baby's even born, that can cause them to hold on to these early reflexes. So, um, you know, stress exposure, drug exposure, any sort of trauma during these early stages. One of the ways that our brains can respond to that is by holding on to this kind of hyperactive and immature stress response. So we know, I'm very excited that trauma is becoming something that people are really understanding, and we're aware that what happens to us early on can impact us later. And one of the physical ways that we can measure this and actually tell that it's true is by looking at our startle reflex and our stress response and how it develops. And newborns have a very sensitive and hyperactive startle reflex called the Moro, and that's something that should mature into a much more dynamic stress response where we have a lot of different variations to how we respond. We tend to be less physiologically reactive. We tend to be less hypervigilant. We can filter things out. We can process other information a lot more easily. But when there's a lot of traumatic things that happen during those early stages, one thing that you can see is that the brain holds on to that kind of hypersensitive stress response. And then they're really kind of reacting and responding out of this kind of survival mechanism where they're kind of stuck in this hypervigilant state, and they haven't developed a mature response to the environment. So that's a big thing that we're looking at. And I think I've gotten off track with the original
Oh, not at
question, but
all. No, no, no. And so what I hear you saying is even older kids can develop the capacity to, I think what you're talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, to integrate a Moro reflex if
yes,
it
definitely.
hasn't been
Yes.
integrated. Okay, so I want people, and you can tell me what words you use. I have heard this language as reflex integration or
Hmm.
neuromuscular reflex integration. Is that
Hmm.
kind of the playing field we're on here?
You're spot on.
Okay. Fantastic. Um, and so the idea being, and again, jump in here anytime, right? This moral reflex, for example, after a certain point, because the brain has developed such that there are more complex things happening in it, this moral reflex, which is very, very important early on and keeps us alive, is now preventing the brain. It's like a pothole or a pothole that's been overfilled. It's like a speed bump
Hmm.
in the process, in the automaticity of other processes that need to happen. Explain this better than me, please.
Yeah, no, that's correct. So basically, it gets disruptive to normal day-to-day functions. So a more mature response would involve connections to other parts of our brain that help us to evaluate a situation, to either not react or to calm down after a small reaction, or to have any number of more dynamic responses to the situation. The
Mhm.
Moro is a very rudimentary and simple response. So what happens is a child with a Moro gets startled and they have this big physiological reaction. So basically, they're just kind of living in, like a state of heightened stress all of the time. And it takes a while for that to calm back down,
You
which
just
is,
described every single child whose parents I talk to.
I know. It's unfortunately a really common thing that I see. I see tons and tons of kids with retained Moro reflexes. It's,
Mhm.
especially in the US, it's kind of a problem.
Mhm.
But what should happen then is or what happens then when kids keep this Moro reflex is not only is it disruptive to our day-to-day function, but you see this big negative domino effect with the way the rest of the brain can develop after. So when you're living in this kind of chronic stress state, it's going to negatively impact things like gut health and immune function. It's going to really negatively impact things like emotion regulation and how we develop frustration tolerance and, the ability to mature socially and emotionally. And then the other thing that I see is it really tanks attention. So a big part of our ability to regulate our attention, to focus, has to do with how well our body processes environmental input. And so if we are kind of constantly in this hyper aroused state, it becomes really difficult to filter out unnecessary information and to tune into things that we want to tune into. And attention is the foundation of a lot of different executive functioning pieces. You need attention in order to develop all of the more advanced skills that make up adulthood and older childhood. So, really, like anytime I see kids that are struggling with those pieces, emotion regulation, attention, it's a big red flag that I at least want to check and see if that moro is there. There can be plenty of other reasons why kids are struggling with those things too. It's not that everybody always has a moro, but it's certainly worth checking, especially because so much of our environment and our culture and the things that we experience during those early stages leads to a lot of retained moros. We have a lot of like toxin exposures. We have a lot of chronic stress. We have a lot of parental mental health struggles. We have a lot of birth trauma. We have a lot of trauma for moms and babies postpartum. There's just a lot of things going on that are kind of really priming babies up to hold on to this. So it's become a really common thing that I see in a lot of the kids that I work with.
Okay. So this is so good. The thing I want to point out here, lest anybody listening say, "Oh my God, you're right. I was pregnant during COVID. For sure, I had toxic levels of stress, and now my child is 6, whatever. It's my fault." That is not what we're saying. Okay.
No, definitely not.
I'm sure you had this conversation with clients before. Tell us what you tell them.
Well, first of all, what I tell them is that some of these things are just out of our control,
Yeah.
and also that we're very resilient. Typically, what I see is that it takes multiple risk factors before kids are unable to cope. And I think the other thing to consider is that there's so many environmental toxins and things that our babies are exposed to that you can really do everything right, quote unquote, and still have babies that are susceptible to these things. Some kids are genetically more sensitive and more susceptible to environmental toxins and triggers, and that just may be what happens. And also, the mom guilt is plentiful. It's out there and it doesn't serve anyone. So we need less of that for sure.
Just please dump it by the side of the road, and just keep driving.
Exactly.
Okay. The thing I love about this conversation, and even before, again, before we hit record, is you are making a direct link between neurology and reflexes in this particular case and behavior. Do you want to
Mhm.
talk a little bit about how you see those? Because I think it's really similar to mine, and that makes me feel so happy.
Sure, I can. So behavior is interesting. I rarely look at behavior as behavior. I pretty much always look at behavior as some form of communication or some like evidence of what's going on underneath. Behavior is the very tip of the iceberg that we see that everybody hyper focuses on, and there's so many things going on underneath. And sure, there are some things that you can do to adjust behavior and some tools and tricks and things that can be helpful. But if you're not really addressing everything that's going on underneath, behavior is really not something to focus on, in my opinion. For the most part, I feel like most kids, if they can behave well, they do behave well. And that's not always everybody's opinion, but it's something that I see regularly in my practice. I don't do anything behavioral. I'm not a behaviorist. I don't give any behavioral sort of advice. But so much of the time, when we focus on the stress response and helping kids work with these things, all of a sudden the behavior disappears and it goes away. And these kids are able to like thrive and function and they are happy. If you see a child that is melting down, very rarely do you have a kid that is having a meltdown because they just enjoy that and want to. I'm not saying it's never existed ever, but for the most part, these are kids that are struggling and they don't want to be struggling. And we're all just stuck trying to figure out how to help this poor child because we don't want it, they don't want it, and nobody knows what they're doing. So that's typically my take on behavior.
Mine too. Thank you. I love that.
Sure.
Okay. So when you are working with families and kids, I heard you say, you're not a behaviorist, you don't do behavioral strategies. What is it that you do with people and why? Like, sketch it out in terms of these early motor experiences and ongoing development. Like, kind of frame the thing for us here.
Sure. So probably the thing that it looks the most similar to that people might be familiar with would be OT, occupational therapy. So we're doing a lot of hands-on physical stuff. I also incorporate some connection things because the parent-child relationship, that connection is really important. In fact, all of the things that we're doing, I teach parents how to do. So they come to me, we do the evaluation, figure out what kids need, and then I teach parents how to do the actual exercises and the hands-on work, and then they are doing it with their kids at home. And that's important because it has to be done very consistently and regularly, so nobody needs to come in to see me to do that. Parents can do it on their own. So that piece, just for the time's sake, is important. But also, I really feel like there's a huge benefit to having parents and kids doing this work together, especially when we're talking about really early brain function and early nervous system, kind of everything in that safety, attachment, kind of stress response world. That's very dependent on parent-child relationships and connections. Our ability to feel safe and regulated as infants is utterly dependent on our caregiver and how they're taking care of us. So there's a lot of things that I do to help kind of build in the relationship and connection piece, which I think is probably as important as the physical hands-on work that we're doing. I don't think that you can recreate this in like an occupational therapy office. I think that we need the relational piece and we need the physical development piece. So it's mostly hands-on exercises, different things that parents are taking their kids through, different movements and ways of stimulating different parts of the brain and body that naturally help kids to work through those reflexes or to develop better vestibular function or visual skills or all of these other kind of early physical pieces. I work on a lot of different things. Reflexes are a big part of it, but it's one of, several areas that we're working on.
Okay. So one of the things that babies do, typically developing babies, is start to, when they're lying on their backs, they kind of at some point notice that, oh, there are some things at the end of my arms, and they bring that fist to their mouth. Mm-hmm. Pick that one or pick a different one and explain why that is important in the life of a 12-year-old, for example. Why is it important that I have this early motor experience? Like, sure. Walk me through this, because I'm not sure that people have connected the dots here. We're all like, did they walk? Fine. Did they crawl? Fine. Although even that one, people are like, they never crawled. Maybe that's a better one, right?
Yeah.
What's happening in early motor experiences that's so important? Like, why?
Sure. Okay, so let me back up before we jump into the specifics, but I think crawling will be a good one to get into. So one of the key things that's important to remember and to understand about brain development is that it happens from the bottom up and from basic to more complicated. So we're always developing simple skills first, and then other pieces are built on top of that. And that happens physically from the bottom, where we're looking at the spinal cord and the brainstem, to the top of the brain. That's the prefrontal cortex. It develops sometime, there's debate in the 20s. That keeps changing too. So sometime very later beyond childhood. And all that whole process of maturation happens through movement, use, and experience. So the way that we move our body, the way that we interact with our environment, and the things that we experience regularly shape that process. So, for example, if we don't move our body, if you have infants, for example, that maybe grew up in an orphanage where they were just left alone in a cot for a long time and they didn't get a lot of movement and input, you see big holes and gaps in the way that their brain develops and functions. Like this, these experiences are directly related to how our brain develops. And
I want you to pause there for just a second.
Mhm.
You're not saying because they were left alone in a cot, they don't have the muscle strength to walk. You're saying their brains have developed differently and they are missing things that they're missing foundational skills that would then be able to be built upon, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes. And what's important to think about is we often think of the brain as kind of this separate piece in our head that's floating there, but the reality is our brain and body are completely interconnected and interdependent on one another. And physical development and physical skills are a direct reflection of how well our brain and body is functioning, especially early on in early development. The kind of learning that we're doing during those early stages is our brain and body learning how to function together and how to develop and grow together. So, all of the things that we experience, the ways that we move, the ways we interact with our environment when we're little, shape the way that our brain develops and functions. And probably one of the easiest ways to understand that is by looking at vision and how we use our eyes.
Mhm.
So, the ability to see is a developed skill that happens based on how we use our eyes. So babies don't come out of the womb really knowing how to see. They have very poor vision. They can only see about 12 to 18 inches from their face. Everything is pretty blurry. They mostly see a lot of contrast. They don't have clear color definition. There's just a lot of skills that they don't have because they have very minimal light exposure in the womb. They do have light exposure, they can see, but they just don't get any sort of depth or anything like the rich experience we have outside. And once they're born, they have to use their eyes in a lot of ways that teach their eyes how to work. And so babies don't necessarily they wouldn't automatically do these things, except that they have all of these wonderful built-in reflexes that force their brain and body to work properly. So
Mm.
one of the big jobs of these early reflexes is to encourage all of these different movements that help them to develop things like vision, so that by the time that they're older, they have really good control of their eyes. They can move and use their eyes without it requiring a lot of effort. It's just automatic. So for those of us who develop typically and we have good eye function, we don't have to think about moving our eyes. We don't have to think about them focusing. We don't have to focus on something and then take a long time to refocus somewhere else. We don't have a hard time tracking something that's moving or tracking a line of print. These things happen automatically, they happen easily. They're just not a problem for us. When you have kids that don't develop these skills, then they're trying to use their eyes and also learn and also read and also tune out sensory input in the environment, and it just falls apart. And that's kind of like one small example of, one of the pieces. Crawling is especially important because it is helping to stimulate both sides of the body at the same time and get opposite movements and coordination of the left and right sides. That is directly affecting the way the left and right sides of our brain communicate and how our body is building the connections between the left and right sides. It's one of the things that influences that. They're also going from looking at something that's close by to looking up around the room. It's the first time that they are choosing where they are moving in their environment. So everything else up until that point is passive. Now all of a sudden they get to decide where they're going, and that changes the type of input they get. So we know that there is a connection between crawling and literacy. We know that kids that skip crawling are more likely to have problems reading and writing later on. We know that when you look at cultures where babies don't crawl, there's a few indigenous cultures that we've looked at. Those babies are typically worn until they can walk, and then they walk. They don't spend a lot of time outdoors crawling. Those cultures tend to have really good farsight vision, so something that's really good for things like hunting and gathering, but they don't typically have a written language. And so we know that there is something about crawling that helps us to develop literacy in a big way. And so that's one example.
I mean, so the reason this podcast is called the Complicated Kids Podcast is only partially because we are mostly talking about when things go wrong. Or when things are kind of askew. What you have just described is typical development. It's so complicated.
Yeah.
But it looks so effortless when it's going well. And I just am always in awe of the whole
Yeah.
process. Like the fact that there are 7 billion of us on this planet or 8 billion or whatever, and we're not like bumping into ourselves or each other all the damn time is like a mystery to me, really. Like a sacred mystery. Okay. So we've kind of touched upon like this trajectory of this very complex interactions between reflexes, motor patterns, and learning. So again, I think we're going to cycle back a little bit to when my a 7-year-old is having difficulty learning how to read, and we send them to a reading tutor. What are we missing potentially?
Well, you're missing all of the things that go into reading. So, reading for example, one of the big things that I see that's common is kids that struggle with reading often have problems with their way their eyes function and develop. So they have poor visual motor skills. The other common thing that I see is problems with their vestibular system, which is this little apparatus in the ear that helps you know where you are in space. And it really kind of coordinates with a lot of other parts of our body to help give us stable perception, which is important for understanding direction and understanding, you know, orientation, which is important for math and reading and noticing, kind of automatically noticing the difference between things like B, P, D. Those things should be quick and automatic. There's certain reflexes that affect the way the left and right sides of our body and our brain communicate that can make things like tracking and crossing the midline really difficult. So there's just all of these foundational pieces that need to be in place first before we would say this kid's got a learning problem or a reading problem. You can't say that they have a reading problem if their eyes don't work right. You can't say they have an attention problem if they are in this like heightened state of stress. Like it's normal to not pay attention when you're hypervigilant and stressed out. So we have to kind of deal with these pieces first. Because remember, I mentioned the brain develops in a very orderly way. We have to start from the bottom and work to the top. And reading is a pretty advanced skill. And if we think of this as a learning problem, that is an advanced brain skill. We need to make sure kids have the tools that they need first before we jump into that.
Oh, there is like so much here. And we're going to get you back to talk more. My head is going to like, it might explode. Actually, it's so exciting. Emily, if we're going to pin it here for now, if people want to learn more about you and your practice, what should they do?
Sure. Probably the best place would be to go to my website, which is earlyrootsTherapy.com. Also on Instagram and Facebook at Early Roots. That's probably the best place to find information.
Oh my gosh. And stay tuned for part 2 and or part 3, because this was a treat. Thank you.
Thank you so much.